But coming right up, we have our panel on web standards, which I'm totally geeked out over, so that's cool. So joining me on stage today is Bromann, who's a founding engineer of Stateful, Jordan Harband, staff developer relations engineer at Coinbase, and James Snell at Cloudflare, who's a system engineer. Come on up, gang. And I also want to give a shout out to Jory Burson. Jory couldn't be here today, so I'm filling in for Jory on the standards panel. So, all right. Hey, welcome, gang.
How are you all doing?
Yeah, we're good. We have our standards working group where I get to see a lot of you all the time. Buried. So just give me a quick intro and just tell me the things that you're working on in the standards space, and then we'll go into a little more detail.
Okay. Yeah, I'll start. So I'm James Snell. I'm working with Cloudflare, also on the Node Technical Steering Committee. The fact that I'm working on 2 different runtimes there kind of makes it quite painfully obvious that there needs to be a lot more coordination and standards on the APIs between the different runtimes and browsers. So that's the space that I'm working on, is try to get more interoperability.
Cool. We'll talk more about that.
Okay.
Jordan.
Sure. My work in the standards space is primarily on TC39, the committee that manages the JavaScript specification. So I'm championing a number of proposals, but also plenary is actually this week, so we have a meeting about 6 times a year, and every feature that's proposed for the JavaScript language is discussed at length over a long period of time, and so we talk about that stuff, and then I'm involved in the standards working group for the OpenJS Foundation and try to participate in Node as much as I can.
Great. Christian?
Yeah, I'm Christian. In my previous company, I had a role where I was following the standardization process of how we automate browsers these days to use it for testing and automation purposes.
Great. So folks who don't really track standards as much, talk about like maybe the misperceptions and some of the realities between open source and open standards.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a great one. A lot of folks tend to see standards as being fixed, like this is the way it absolutely has to be done, right? And in universal, where most of the time standards are no different than different projects, and there's multiple standards. There's not just one, right? And it's kind of it's a bit of a misnomer, right? Yeah. So standards can be just as opinionated as different pieces of software, and they can be just as fallible, right? There's lots of issues there. So I think the biggest misperception there is just that they don't quite see, how opinionated standards actually can be.
Opinionated,
so, yeah.
Interesting word. How about you all?
And I think that one of the big differences is that if you see an open source project and you think it should be doing something different and they don't, you just go make another project or fork it or something. And but with standards, you can do that, but it's not quite as effective because the power of a standard isn't the document, it's the group of the community that's respecting it, that's following it. And so it can seem more static, it can seem less approachable as a result. But in reality, it's just the same thing as an open source project. It's a group of people making decisions to the best of their ability.
Good way. Christian?
Yeah, I think a lot of open source projects kind of like have something that shows the value to a broader community. And then the standards go ahead and be like, okay, that project has proven the value for the community. We can now go and make it available in a much more effective way interoperable, like to all browsers.
Yeah. I know I talked about technology living 60 years. I think I was at a standards meeting once with some government folks. They wanted it to last 500 years. What's the reality?
The reality is these things shift all the time, right? When I started my career, we were talking about the WS, the web services stuff, and that quickly evolved. We got into, REST, and there's been common threads in there, but I don't think, other than jQuery, nothing lasts forever, right? Things continue to move, change, and evolve, and we're constantly seeing change.
Yeah, I think there's no definition of done for standards. It's always constantly changing specification, and there will be always new demands that we have to the internet or to the web that will always, require us to work on standards.
Yeah. I mean, JavaScript's been around for 26 or 27 years now, so.
Well, I mean,
Ecmascript.
every now and then people ask, like, well, when is JavaScript finished? When are you going to stop adding features? But the reality is that even if the current group of people run out of things to add, if we don't continue to pay attention to it, then 10 years from now, all the rationales for why things are the way they are may have faded into the past, and mistakes could be made. So it's important to maintain a good history and explanation for the future as well, whether there's new features or not.
Yeah. Why don't you just roll back a little bit and just tell us about who sets the web standards, and particularly, why don't you start with Ecmascript, just for folks who aren't, tracking this all the time.
Sure. So ECMA International is the standards body that owns, I guess, or hosts the Ecmascript standard. There's copyright reasons why it's called that, and the member companies in ECMA, just like in the OpenJS Foundation, are there's a long list of them. You can go on the website and look, and there's different tiers. And the primary benefit is that there's a royalty-free patent agreement. So basically, any ECMA standard, you can be guaranteed that if you use it, you'll never have any legal liability from that. And that is a pretty important thing for a lot of businesses. I've only been on TC39 since 2014, but I think it convened in 97 or 98, something like that. It's been around a very long time. And the makeup of the committee has shifted over the years. It consists of delegates, which are member company representatives, and that shifts over time as well as people change their employment or are done with it. But
yeah, there's this perception that only big vendors kind of control standards. Do you?
I mean, there's some truth to that, given that, there's only 4 and now 3 companies that control web browsers, and so that plays into it. But there's a bit of a power, game theory dynamic going on where the browsers have the ability to just unilaterally control it from everyone else, but they don't want to do that exactly. They want to make sure they're meeting the needs of the web, and they can't do that alone. And so there's sort of a détente, like an agreement between everyone to follow by a consensus-based process and try to meet the needs of everyone while also meeting the constraints of everyone, which is, as you can imagine, a difficult prospect.
Yeah, and that sort of picks up on what you're working on.
Right.
James, you want to give a quick?
So a couple of the other organizations besides ECMA is WhatWG and W3C, and they historically they've been primarily focused on development of these API standards for browsers, right? And even in the charter of the WhatWG, it's like, okay, we define the web as browsers, right? So those are the use cases we're looking at. And no fault to them, they do fantastic work, but browsers are a big space on their own, right? In these groups, they have to scope the work, right? So they, it's like, okay, this is a big enough problem as it is. Let's just focus on these cases. But what ends up happening is that JavaScript is not limited to browsers, right? We have Node, we have Deno, we have stuff running on the edge. So we have all these other use cases that don't quite get considered into those conversations. So the APIs might be great, but they don't quite work as well in these other environments. And for the longest time, when it was just like browsers and Node, right? Node went off and said, okay, we're not a browser, we're going to do things our own way. And when you only have 2 environments, it's okay to, it's easier to get away with that. But you introduce Deno, you introduce, Fastly and Cloudflare, and all these, other places that JavaScript is running, it suddenly becomes a lot more difficult to justify everything working in different ways and completely ignoring a whole new set of use cases. So this new community group that we got launched here just in the past month and a half. We'll be talking about it a little bit later today. but it's a web interoperable runtimes community group. The whole focus is, hey, there's a whole new set of use cases, or a whole other set of use cases outside of browsers that need to be taken into consideration. So let's start bringing them into the conversation.
Yep. You call it Winter
Yeah,
CG,
Winter CG,
a
yeah,
community
sure,
group,
yeah.
right? Yeah. Great. We'll follow up on that. Christian, you've been working in this space as well. Tell me about some of the things you're working on.
So I've been participating in the standardization process of how we automate browsers, and I've been part since 2018. And 2019, we started a new kind of initiative because the first idea of how we automate browser, being in the WebDriver specification, started way back before there was a thing like React or Angular or Vue and Svelte. So it was designed with the idea that you can do everything that the user wants to do. But now with the moving everything to the browser, having single-page applications, there's more demand on introspecting the browser, which was not taken care of in the first version of the protocol. So the browser vendors and people that were part of the working group have now been focusing on creating a new version that tries to meet the demands of how we want to test browsers today. And just last week, Firefox 101 was released. That came with the first primitives of the new WebDriver BIDA protocol, and that allows us to now do more things, and in the future there will be more of those features coming, which is exciting.
Great. And who else is working on that? Like what kind of?
Usually on those working group meetings, we have people that work on the browser teams for every of the big browsers. You have folks from companies like BrowserStack or Source Labs who are just big adopter, who have a large set of customers that use or sometimes even abuse those protocols, and so that's a great resource of feedback. But you have also folks from other web specification that come to the working group because they are working on a WebDriver extension for their standard, not only because they want to have users also testing that standard, but also they want to build that WebDriver extension so they can test their own specification much better. So those kind of people.
Great. Let's talk about some of your end users on the Winter CG.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so all the non-browser cases, so we're talking about the folks that are developing on Node on the back end or Dino, and not just even back end, like command line applications and those kinds of things, but also on the edge, so Cloudflare workers and Fastly functions. I mean, there's this growing set of places where JavaScript literally is becoming everywhere, right? Everyone in that space, it's like, okay, they're not just developing for one area, right? They're developing for the full stack, even for the browsers. So, all of their developers are, we don't want to have to learn one way of doing it in the browser, right? We don't have to learn one way of doing it for Node, and then, okay, now we're going to switch to Dino for some application. Now we have to completely change everything that we're doing, right? So it's just become very unwieldy for them. So the use case really is just, let's just write JavaScript once, and have it work consistently across these environments, be able to test it consistently, and move forward from there. So.
Well, I think I saw the word interoperability everywhere in your blog.
Yeah.
So really, I mean, is the adoption of standards really the path to interoperability? Trick question.
Yeah. It's the start, right? It's the start down that path, right? There's so much more to it. Testing is a huge part of it, right? Just testing conformance. Just because the standard exists doesn't mean people are actually implementing it correctly or fully, or it doesn't even necessarily mean that they can't, right? So Node just implemented fetch, right? Finally it's there. Mostly, right? It's not full fetch, right? It's it doesn't have the cookie support. I mean, there's a lot that's in the spec that's not there. Well, I mean, does that mean it's a compliant implementation? Does it actually conform to the spec? Well, I think an argument could be made both yes and no, right? How do we validate that? So just the mere presence of the standard, nowhere near enough, right? There's a lot more to do.
Right. Anyone else?
I think that was well said.
That was well said, yeah. So Jordan, you were an editor. You have been an editor for quite a while. I think you just finished your...
editor of the JavaScript spec from 2018 to 2021.
Yeah. How did you get started? And how do new people who think this is super cool, how do you get started in this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different paths in, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more of that about that sort of journey for me in a panel I have later today. but I would say that just like on an open source project, code is not the only thing that is needed to make it better, to improve it, to move it forward. You know, implementing things in browsers is one thing, but it's not the only thing. Writing the spec text is one thing, but it's not the only thing. So I would say start paying attention to, you just pick a proposal, or just go into the spec and try and understand, you know, some part of JavaScript and how it's specified. I have another panel later today about that as well. So, you know, it's just kind of take a look around and figure out what interests you, and you know, start poking away at it. And I think, you know, just like on an open source project, I think you'll find that if you show up with enthusiasm and respect and a willingness to learn, that your presence will be welcomed.
Yep. Right, and I know I had participated in the W3C, the branding task force. There's so many ways for all kinds of folks to get involved, yeah. Christian, how'd you get involved?
Well, it was always kind of an interesting area for me because, you know, you can code you can implement something that's that, but there's much more behind that, behind the curtain, that is interesting. And the whole process of writing a specification, it's kind of like coding with words in some way or another, which I see also in the WebDriver spec, where you cannot just say when you want to click on an element, you just do this. No, you have to reference to other specifications so that every browser has common words to describe how certain things have to happen, and that also makes sure that it happens in the same way and across all browsers. So it's just a fascinating process for me to follow that, and that's why I stayed involved.
Great, James?
Yeah, so I've been involved with standards for a long, like going back to the web services and stuff. Sorry about that. But the involvement was just very organic over time, and a lot of it is find, you know, just like Jordan said, find something you're interested in, right? And just start pulling on the thread, right? And you know, see as you pull on that thread, you're going to get deeper and deeper into it, and just see how you enjoy it. I mean, if it's something you have an affinity for and you enjoy it, you're gonna find it out very quickly.
Great.
So.
Also, sometimes when people hear standards, they go, put on the brakes, innovation's just going to start creeping along. So.
That's, you know, historically, yes. I mean, I think there have been good examples where that's been true, but I think we've gotten in a situation now, good patterns now in the ecosystem where that's not as true.
And I would hope that as a society, we've learned that move fast and break things is perhaps not the wisest course, and sometimes slowing down actually lets you move faster later. So, you know, I think being measured and cautious now is always going to make things go more smoothly in the future. And so it's tough as a human being to like optimize for the long term. We're just not good at that as a species, but I think the more that we can be patient in the near term, the faster we'll be able to move in the long term, whether it's standards or anything else.
I feel like every standards group is also looking for optimization in those processes. It's not that they stand still. For the WebDriver spec, for instance, I think one of the first specs in the W3C that have a living spec, where the living spec is the original document. So just they can iterate fast, browsers have implemented it and see how it works. And I think, yeah, that process is changing also, and they always try to optimize.
Mentioning the living spec thing, thank you for doing that. I think that's been a fantastic innovation in this space, where a spec is not done. It's like, perpetually, being worked on. It can be evolved, as opposed to, kind of some of the things I've experienced in the past was some folks go off and write a specification. They stamp it as a standard, and then say, okay, go implement it. And then afterwards, you go implement it and say, I can't do this. Whereas with the living spec, it's, no, we're going to experiment, we're going to allow it we're going to allow the innovation to happen. And okay, that's useful, that actually works, let's just incorporate that in. And I think it's a brilliant process. So.
Great. And some people always ask, aren't there too many standards? I know there's a famous cartoon, and there used to be like battles over, media formats and things like that. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the XKCD that you're referencing is, pretty spot on. I mean, I think it's, one of the advantages of sort of the living standard approach, and the Ecmascript has this stage process after ES 2015 that I think is also fed into that, is that instead of making a standard and then being done and then people find out it doesn't work for them and then they make a new one, you build the standard cooperatively with the implementations, and you build it with the intention and vision of continuing to do that for the foreseeable future. And I think that both makes for a much better standard that can actually be faithfully implemented, but also that avoids the need to fork it as much.
Got it.
Yeah, I think it's good to have the right balance of tools that try to innovate with new things. They sometimes take shortcuts to just prove that the community needs some capabilities. But then it's good to go back and be like, okay, we understand that need now, and we make it interoperable across all browsers, because apparently everyone wants to have that, so everyone should have the same experience across all browsers.
I think, though, it's important to understand that just because a new standard emerges, the old standards don't go away.
Right.
And it doesn't mean everyone's going to go off and rewrite their applications to the new stuff. Like, all of that old code is still going to be there. Companies that have invested years of development on a particular standard, the technology, aren't just going to redo it all, right? So the old standards are never going to go away. They're just going to, we just continue to add to these things. So.
Yeah, it's true. Great. So I know, again, I think you all are pretty much speaking later today or tomorrow and available on, the sponsor floor, but just some sort of final words on what you're working on and how folks can get involved.
Yeah, so with Winter CG, I'm going to be having a talk later on today, kind of going into the details of what we're trying to accomplish, why, and how folks can get involved. So, if you have an interest in that area, please jump in. Outside of that, these things are just like open source projects. You just need to get involved and show up and be part of the conversation. So it's
Great.
Yeah. TC39/proposals on GitHub. It's a very long list. Take a look, find something that interests you, and start poking around.
Great. And I think we have a video either showing right after this a little update on what you all are working on. So I'm sure people can come find you, right, with
Absolutely.
questions. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, same for WebDriver. There's a GitHub project that has the specification for the WebDriver BiDAP protocol. If you're writing an automation tool, then get involved, implement the new protocol. If you're a user, it's just good to come on to the repository, file an issue. If you see something that is just different, works different across browser, because then we haven't really specified it good enough, or you just need, hey, I want to automate that. Can we get this specified as well? So that always helps, and the people also meet openly, so you can join those meetings and participate in them as well.
Great. Anything on your wish list for the world of standards? Like if you could wave your magic wand?
Oh, that's a difficult question.
Wasn't on my list, was it?
Whenever,
No, sorry.
whenever I go to wish list for the standards, it's like for time zones to go away, so time zones stop being an issue.
I mean, pretty much all my wishes involve time travel, so we can avoid making a mistake. Everything that we can do better without changing the past is something we're all already working on really hard. So.
Yeah. Christian?
Yeah, I think in general, there are often tools that that go a little bit faster than the standards, and that's great because they give us inspiration. But they're often it's often good to appreciate the people that then put this into the standard and make it available for everyone, because they don't cut the corners and they want to make it interoperable across. I think for some people, they don't have the requirements to test on all browsers, let's say, but a lot of organizations have, and so that's important.
Great. I mentioned we have our standards working group again on Tuesdays. Tuesdays are my favorite days. We meet every other week, and we have folks from W3C, TC39, TC53, Unicode Consortium. Who else do we have? And it's just really cool just to share all that information and best practices. We're working on an education website. We have a lot of folks who do some great work and bringing new folks along. So, great. Any last words of wisdom?
No, excited to see where things continue to go.
Yeah, same.
And yeah, thanks for having us.
Cool, awesome. Thanks. Okay.